and say, what is Huntington's disease? It is a genetic disease that causes the progressive breakdown of nerve cells in the brain. So that's when you start hearing about a neurodegenerative disease. It deteriorates a person's physical and mental abilities, and it's fatal. There is no cure at this time. Hopefully we will be able to get a cure, but at this time there is no cure. It was described by this gentleman here. So every time I like to kind of see pictures of who really is kind of known in terms of for doing it. This is Dr. George Sumner Huntington. So in 1872, he did like a little talk, he did like a medical journal, and he started talking about Huntington's disease. And I'm going to quote of how he categorized it. He said it was an heirloom from generations away back in the dim past. That's how he described it.
Back in the what?
Yeah?
Back in the what?
Dim past. D-I-M, dim past. And as you can see, it really can be traced to the Middle Ages. The earliest name was chorea, which is a Greek word for dance. Okay, does anybody know what chorea is?
No.
Some of you, okay. It's basically in terms of you can have different kinds of movements. So you can have some kind of twitching movements. You can have in terms of some kind of swaying kind of movements. I think that when I best described it is kind of a twisting, turning in this constant uncontrollable dance-like kind of series. So when you will see it, you will notice it as something that maybe it's something that you don't commonly see. So it's kind of like these uncontrollable, involuntary, jerky kind of movements. Okay? Now, let's see if we can kind of move on. The reason I have, does anyone know, well, you see who this is. Anybody know who Woody Guthrie is? Okay? Woody Guthrie is an American folk singer and composer who is best known for his song, This Land Is Your Land. Well, he had Huntington's disease, probably one of the most famous people who did have Huntington's disease. He suffered from it for more than 15 years. So I think that back in 1940s, he started having some medical issues, which probably really were reflecting Huntington's disease symptoms. However, it took a long time to get a diagnosis for him. And he was misdiagnosed. And this is the part that's pretty, I think, tragic. He was diagnosed as an alcoholic because of some of his movement issues. Okay, so in terms of because people sometimes would be almost look like they're in a walking stupor. That's kind of what sometimes it can look like with Huntington's disease. He was also diagnosed as a schizophrenic. Okay, hospitalized many times and also put in what they at that time was called mental institutions. Okay, but it was a brain disease he was suffering, and that's part of the problem. Even today, I will tell you, a lot of times people get misdiagnosed or on the street. Sometimes, and I've heard this many, many times, people who are police officers might pick someone up because they say someone's drunk, or a security officer will say, hey, I don't, you can't come in here, or I wouldn't be drinking anymore. Okay? And indeed, this person has not had a drink. Okay? But because of how this person's movements, these constant movements, they really get misrepresentative, and that's very, very sad. He died at the age of 55 years old, very relatively young, which is very common for people who have HD. And the Guthrie family has remained very, very committed to HD. Marjorie, which was in terms of his wife, basically, after his death in '68, started to get together with other HD families. So they started finding HD families, and eventually they would be really starting which is called HDSA. I don't know if anybody's heard of HDSA, but it's the Huntington's Disease Society of America. And they have done tremendous, tremendous things in terms of getting with money, with research, advocating. bringing resources. So again, this Guthrie family has been very, very committed. Now, another person who I wanted everybody to be familiar with is this Nancy Wexler. And that's a picture of her. You might as well see who we're looking at. She has a PhD in clinical psychology, but much of her work has really been done, and I think she's devoted her life to Huntington's disease. Her father started the Hereditary Disease Foundation in 1968, so it was certainly involved, and certainly because HD is a genetic disease. However, I think that Dr. Wexler became very interested in it because look at this. Her mother had HD, her grandfather had HD, and 3 of her uncles had HD, which is a lot. To my knowledge, even with all the research, she decided that she did not want to be tested. So she, you know, in terms of for herself. But at the time, when they were looking in terms of her history, you know, it was coming through the grandfather and 3 uncles. And at the time, people were saying, well, maybe it's only going to affect men, okay? That it is not going to be affecting any of the women in the family, which certainly was, you know, something that she saw as her mother had it. So what did Dr. Wexler do? And I think this is really interesting. She collected a team, and they began collecting over 4,000 blood samples, and I'm going to be pronouncing these cities wrong because I usually do, but I'm going to try Barranquitas and La Genta, Venezuela, okay? Which ultimately led to the discovery of the gene, the HD gene, which is, you know, absolutely an unbelievable kind of, you know, information. Now, why did they go to this small town? Okay, why would someone go to Venezuela? Well, it turns out that this population has, they're probably the highest concentration of HD in the world. And they were looking at these 2 cities. Out of 10,000 people, half of the people are either, you know, are at risk, or they themselves have HD. So that's where they started collecting samples and trying to map out who, in effect, you know, really did have HD, and really kind of trying to really follow these family trees, which again, as I said, is a tremendous discovery leading to the gene for HD. So what causes HD? HD is caused by a mutation in the gene for a protein called huntingtin. Now, if you look at it closely, it's not Huntington, it's Huntingtin, which is located on chromosome 4. And we all have this Huntington gene, okay? So everybody has it. What we don't everybody has is some of what they call the CAG repeat expansions. And that's what causes the defect in the mutation. It results in degeneration in the basal ganglia of brain, which is really responsible for the movement, thought, and emotions. But eventually, as the disease progresses, it affects all parts of the brain, and it becomes some really diffuse problems throughout the brain. So when you see these CAG, you wonder, what does that mean? So what I wanted to do is tell people that the CAG stands for cytosine, adenine, and guanine, which the CAG codes for glutamine, which is the building block of DNA. So that's why everybody has it, okay? So these are kind of our building blocks that we all have. Now, in terms of what does that mean? Well, for the number of CAG repeats is what's really important. So if you have 28 or below, and most people have probably 20 or so, but if you have 20 to 28 or even below, that's normal, and that a person will never, ever develop Huntington's disease. Now, if someone has those repeats, those CAG repeats of 29 to 34, they themselves might not develop HD, but the next generation is at risk. Then you have 35 to 39 of the repeats. They may themselves develop HD, but the next generation is at risk. If someone has 40 or more, that individual will be developing HD. Now, I don't know when they'll be developing HD, but they really will be developing HD. So what you have here is it's pretty conclusive. If it's 28 or below, you will not have HD. If it's somebody who is 40 or more, they definitely will develop HD. Between those, it can be inconclusive. Yes, sir?
What do they mean when they say repeats? Repeats
Of the CAG. So the CAG, which is
where?
on the code, on the genetic code that we have. So everybody has a number of CAG, you know, in terms of the repeats, that what you're building on when you're looking at mapping them on this code, okay? And so it will have repeats of CAG, CAG, CAG. If people have more than 28 of those, what you're going to be doing is that's when you have really the risk of developing and certainly being able to, you know, having the HD. And the reason is because then it becomes the longer it is, you know, the more difficulty that you can be having, you know, in terms of with some of the repeats as it goes along. So that's where it's all coming from. It's on the code, the genetic code that we all have. So before doing that, the question becomes, well, how do you know how many CAG repeats do you have, right? Okay, so how would we all know? Well, there is a blood test, which is what came from the 1993 in terms of with Dr. Wexler's work. So it's simply, you know, you can go and get some blood work. Now, that part is easy, the physical process of getting the blood work. The part that becomes more difficult is deciding whether or not to get tested or not. And that's a huge, huge decision for anybody. Yes, ma'am?
Yes, I have been tested quite a few times and with my blood work and looking at everything. And do you have to ask them or do they automatically?
Oh, no, yeah, this is a separate test. This is a very, very, very specific test which will not come with normal blood work. Okay, it doesn't come with normal blood work. And most people who really, when you look at it, who do not have any family history of HD, okay, and they're showing no signs of like kind of movement issues or any kind of significant issues, most people wouldn't even be taking this test. Usually what you would do, and to take this test, what you do is you have to go through some pre-genetic counseling. So somebody is going to be sitting down with you and they're going to be kind of asking you questions about like, because they want a real family history. So this is not going to go out to the general public. It does not need to, as we're going to, you know, be discovering, because you're not, unless, you know, there is some parent, your parent has, you know, HD or as having some CAG repeats that would be high enough that they could be put at risk for the next generation. Otherwise, there's no reason for someone in the general population to be tested. Yes, ma'am?
Sounds like a problem with too much of some kind of chemicals or a virus, antivirus that can balance that?
It's not too much chemicals. It's that it's a mutation, that the CAG has repeated and repeated and repeated itself. And so as it repeated itself, when you have a longer chain, then it becomes more unstable.
There's no way to inhibit that?
Well, the point is it's genetic, it's hereditary, okay? So the thing is that if you don't have any family members that have it, then you don't even have to worry about it, okay? But again, a lot of people do not know their family history of what it's all about, okay? And as we're going to see just shortly, not everybody who has a parent who has it will get this. But the blood test, the reason what they did, and this was, I think, pretty interesting, they did a survey, I think, in Lancelot in 2007, and really looked at how many people who were at risk, let's say, for HD. And there was some statistic that only 5% of that population decided that they wanted to be tested. And 95% said, I don't want to. And the reason is that, the reason that they thought it is that, number one, the people who wanted to be tested say, I want to have certainty more of my life. I want to be planning my life. I want to know what's going on. Maybe I want to know if I want to have children or not children. The 95% who decided not to get tested. The two main reasons were, number one, there's no cure, so why do it? Okay, there's nothing you can do because there's no medication that's going to even slow the progression of the disease. And second of all, what am I doing to my children? If I know, am I putting them how much at risk? The other thing that can happen with testing, unfortunately, is that people look at their job security. And a lot of times you start having symptoms of HD well before you've been diagnosed. Now, there is the GENE Act, which is the Genetic Non-Discriminatory Act, where you really can't be fired for some condition. However, many times people can get around that. Okay, I mean, you're not supposed to federally mandated that somebody can't get fired for a disease. It doesn't mean that things could be made uncomfortable. Second of all, in terms of insurance, yes, you would be able to get medical insurance, but if you're diagnosed with HD, I will tell you, you will probably not get long-term health insurance, you probably won't get any life insurance, and you probably won't get disability insurance. So there's reasons that people ended up not being tested. Okay? Now, who's going to develop HD? It is known as a quintessential family disease because every child of a parent with HD has a 50-50 chance of carrying this faulty gene. 50-50 chance, which means if a parent has it, you might get it or you might not, but it's 50-50, luck of the draw or unluck of the draw. Now, it can be passed down by both the mother and the father. Okay, so it's not just coming from one line. It is a dominant gene. So if you get the gene from a parent, okay, and your other parent does not have Huntington's, you still will get that because it's a dominant gene. Now, if a child inherits the HD gene, they're going to eventually develop it. Not necessarily, you don't know when, and they'll say usually, as we're going to talk later, the longer those repeats, probably the sooner that someone will get it, but someone will eventually develop it. If a child does not inherit that faulty gene, and then they're not in that inconclusive kind of area where they're at risk, they will never develop HD and they will never pass it on to the next generation. And that's important to know.
Yeah, so it doesn't ever skip a generation?
It doesn't skip generations, no. So either you have the gene, the HD gene, and it gets passed along, or you do not, and it does not get passed along. Now, HD affects both males and females, all races and all ethnic groups. Okay, so it's not just kind of set to one set. The estimation in the US is probably about 30,000 symptomatic individuals and many more at risk. That's not very many. 30,000, some people I've heard 39,000. We're talking about a baseball stadium. You fill that up, and that's right now in the US. So compared to many of your other diseases like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, it's a very, very small percentage. Now the prevalence worldwide is estimated at 2.71 per 100,000. With Asia appearing to have lower incidences than Europe, North America, and Australia. And when I was looking at it, I think my statistics said I think it's 0.4 per 100,000 with Asia, where it's about 5.7 with North America. And I'm going to double check because sometimes my memory isn't as good with that as possible. And yes, and it's like 5.7 per 100,000. For Europe, North America, and Australia. So you can see people in terms of Asia, there's certainly less of a risk. Now, this is probably a very underestimation because a lot of people don't really, in terms of, are not familiar with HD, and sometimes, as we said before, it's misdiagnosed. Okay? Now, in looking at the progression, the rate of disease progression and the age of onset can vary from individual to individual. In general, don't be concerned. That's just how it works. Okay, in terms the shades go up and down. Okay. In general, larger gene expansions are associated with an earlier onset. Now, symptoms most commonly appear between 30 and 50 years old, so that's the most common, worsen over a 10 to 25-year period, but they can emerge as early as age 2, which would be a juvenile HD. Now, one of the things that they did have a documented case of a 2-year-old who had over 100 repeats, CAG repeats. I think it was about 109, 110, okay, which is a lot. That was been the most documented. And again, his case was very, very, very severe. Death is typically due to complications such as malnutrition or pneumonia. Now, in looking at the stages of HD, you have what's called a pre-symptomatic stage, which there are no clinical motor signs and no cognitive decline. Nobody would really suspect someone has HD. You also have what's called a prodromal, where there might be some subtle changes in emotion and thinking, but really no really marked movement difficulties. And a lot of times in terms of you're going to have behavior and cognitive changes well before even some of the movement. That's why for the pre-symptomatic and prodromal, it's called that's pre-manifest. Pre-manifest means before having some of these marked physical kinds of signs. The manifest stage, roughly, and again, everybody different, so this is just a really rough measure, can be divided into early stages where you do have changes in coordination, difficulty thinking, mood issues. You can have the middle stages where movements become more problematic. People can have decreased speech, more difficulty swallowing, and ordinary activities become much more difficult in terms of when you're looking at activities like eating and dressing and bathing, things like that. The late stage is where someone is really totally dependent on a care partner, and they will have choking problems. Chorea becomes either more severe or it ceases completely. People really are unable to walk. Many times they're confined to a wheelchair or later on into a bed. They have difficulty speaking really, and they are really unable to speak. But which is probably pretty sad and disheartening, is they're still able to really comprehend, and they can still have some of the awareness, which you know that your body is shutting down. You really can still be aware of what's going on. This, I don't know how well people can see this, but this is looking at someone who is really looking at in terms of the disease burden right here. This is from the Predict HD and Track HD. These are kinds of studies that have been going around where they have been really following people. But if you're looking at the pre-manifest, and remember, this is where people in terms are not showing any of the signs, so that would be the pre-symptomatic and the prodromal, okay? Function seems to be okay, and really you're not really starting to see some of the difficulties until with the motor and the cognitive and really the chorea until, really starting like right here, this is really very early, but you can see how it really progresses along the way. So that's with that here. And you're seeing in terms of how function, people are very, very functional in these pre-manifest stages, still in the early stages, still really being pretty well functioning. It's only at more of the advanced stages. Now, compare this to what's going on in the brain. If you look at it in terms of the brain, you start seeing changes are happening much earlier, okay, in terms of the cortical gray matter, the globus pallidus, the cortical white matter, striatal volume. So you're starting to see changes here much earlier than you will see them in terms of enough functional. And that really does happen where a lot of the changes that might be happening out in the brain could be 10 to 20 years before. So I think that's really interesting to note that it does not become necessarily clinically apparent until much later. Now, looking at juvenile onset, this is a form of HD that affects children and teenagers. That's probably 10% of all cases of HD are more of in terms of juvenile. There is a more rapid progression rate than in the adult onset. So when you're thinking of, and this is in terms of from once people have been diagnosed, usually someone in terms of what adult would be 10 to 25 years. We're talking with children, it could be 10 years, okay, before they die. The presentation includes changes in personality, coordination, behavior, speech, or ability to learn new information. A lot of times things are picked up where people start having difficulty in school. Okay? They're having difficulty with their handwriting, their difficulty in terms of really being able to understand and to read and to, you know, do things that you're needing to do some thinking with. So that would happen, as well as obviously in terms of some behavioral issues. One of the main differences between juvenile onset and adult is that seizures and rigidity are much more common in children, and chorea is more common in adults. Okay, not necessarily. I mean, it still can. Everybody can certainly have some of these same symptoms, but that seems to be one of the differences. Usually, people in juvenile have a higher CAG repeats also. So many times they might have 70 or more. So usually they really do have a much more higher repeats. I just want to kind of briefly go over through this in terms of the HD effects and look at these in a little bit more detail. What you have to consider, it is a neurodegenerative disease that affects movement, cognition, and behaviors and emotion, all of them. Okay? Sometimes people have said, and I heard it quoted, that it's kind of like the worst of getting, you know, in terms of ALS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's disease all at once. Okay? In looking at the movements, that's what we're talking about, that involuntary jerking or twitching, or you can have rigidity and like freezing up. Okay? Slowness and poorly coordinated movements. A lot of times you might see some clumsiness. People kind of like falling, you know, there's falls going on. There is a different way in terms of their stance and their walking. So again, all that really would go under the movements. The diminished muscle control, which does really cause speech problems. Many times it becomes more and more difficult to understand someone given their speech problems. And people have swallowing problems as well, again, because it's affecting the muscle control there. Now, what really happens then is when you think about it is that for somebody to really seek the treatment they need, they really do need a comprehensive treatment. So what they would do is they would need to go to a speech and language pathologist. They would need to, in terms of maybe go to a doctor, you know, and a neurologist for some of their, you know, movement problems, as well as maybe go in terms of talk to a psychiatrist. You also need the OT, the occupational therapy, because again, this is a disease that's affecting everything. Now, weight loss can be a serious consequence of chorea. So for anybody who, you know, when you think about worrying about, you know, in terms of your weight, people who do have HD, they can probably eat up to 5,000 calories per day. And that's even just to help maintain. And it's because they're in constant motion and burning so many calories. This is a really serious problem because you got to keep eating and eating and eating, and it's still really not enough. Behavior and emotional effects. Behavior issues can surface early in HD and continue as the disease progresses. These can be probably also very distressing to an individual, family, and friends, and most likely are the reason behind some of the placement. Okay? Common behavior issues can include the aggression, apathy, impulsivity, irritability, and some of these emotional outbursts, which can become very dangerous. People can become violent. It's not them, it's the disease that's working there. And so what you have to do is people who are caregiving really have to take sometimes some safety precautions and make sure that they're safe and that they really do want to have their loved ones safe as well. The depression comes about because of changes in the brain, as well as what you think about it. This disease is probably depressing and very socially isolating for someone who does have HD. Looking at the unawareness, one of the things that does happen is people who do have HD many times are unaware of some of your deficits. You're really not aware that maybe you can't do certain things or that you can't do them as well as you did before. And it's not denial. It is certainly that people are just unaware of that. And then some of the obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors. Now, the reason I brought up suicidality is because HD patients have higher rates of suicide than any other neurodegenerative diseases. It's high. Among HD patients, historically, suicide ideation was found in 26%, so that's over 1/4%. Self-reported suicide attempts, almost 10%, and the current suicide ideation, 20%. That's huge, and it's compared to maybe suicide ideation is 3.3 in the general population, and suicide attempt is under 1%. So look at the difference. It's almost, there was a study done that's probably 8 times the amount of people who are 50 years old who have HD. They have 8 times the chance of some kind of suicide than someone in the general public. The increased rates of suicide will become immediately after someone receives a diagnosis, which is very devastating. There's no way of getting around it, as well as a lot of when their independence becomes really diminished. Cognitive effects. People have difficulty organizing, prioritizing, and focusing on tasks. They seem to get stuck on thoughts and actions. There's different problems in attention, concentration, multitasking. In terms of learning, people have difficulty learning new information and retaining. And especially in retaining when you're asking someone something, if it's like a free recall, they really have a lot of difficulty. And people can benefit for many years with cues, you know, so somebody kind of cueing them along to help them remember. The cognitive deficits can precede the appearance of motor symptoms by as many as 10 to 20 years. Now, this I wanted to bring up before I bring up some of our really guest kind of speakers. And we have one more who's included here who just kind of came on, Joanne, who's also a care partner as well. But this is called Faces of HD. And I would really encourage everybody to go to the HDSA website, read about personal reflections, and see pictures of those affected by HD, which would include friends, family, caregivers, volunteers, those who are at risk, and those themselves who have been diagnosed. It is a wonderful website for people to really get some kind of perspective that there isn't just one person who you can identify as HD. There's very, very many people with that. I'm going to stop here right now for a little bit, and I'm going to bring up, you know, in terms of some of people who I've asked to come and just kind of share their experiences, because I think that's really, really important to know. We're going to kind of start out maybe with Yvonne and Jeff, if you don't mind. Okay, and come on up, Joanne, also. Okay. All right. And I'm just going to do first names. Okay, we have 2 care partners here. Joanne is a care partner and Jeff is a care partner. And Yvonne has HD. Okay, so in looking at her, you know, she looks fine, right? But I think that maybe what I'd like to do is if you would like to kind of just share something about some of your experiences briefly with you know, I guess the group, I think that would be absolutely wonderful.
All right.
Okay?
Thank you, Donna.
Okay.
First of all, Donna Miller is
Can we hear her? Should I kind of move this around?
I have a little trouble with my voice volume, so I'm sorry. I sometimes talk too loudly if it's a mic, so tell me to soften my voice. I have trouble knowing in normal conversation how loud my voice is and how to regulate it. I wanted to say that Donna is our support group leader here at LouRuvo, and LouRuvo provides that just for people who are in part of an HD family once a month on the I think
this is the mic.
3rd Thursday at noon. Oh, sorry, I thought this was the mic.
This is okay. We're gonna, no, here.
I'm
It's real small. Okay, go ahead.
These are all good examples of me. If you tell me that's a mic, I'll use it as a mic. And when Donna called us up here, I just walked in one direction, and I thought that was where I needed to stay. And that's just, those are the things I'm dealing with. My husband and Donna kind of led me over here very kindly. HD was on my dad's side. His father was born in Arkansas, so there are many people in Arkansas with HD. We also had family that moved to Texas, Oklahoma, many people in those states also, and even California. During the Depression, my grandfather and my grandmother traveled to California, where my dad was born, and 2 other siblings of his. So there's a preponderance of patients there also. My dad and one of his sisters had it. It was random. And on his side, many of his he had mostly uncles, not very few women on his side of the family, and many of them got it. So some people did think, like Donna said, oh, maybe it's a male thing, but it wasn't. His father passed it down to him and my aunt. And then my dad had 4 children. And after that, he had been married. He sat us all down, and it was actually not too many years after Woody Guthrie had died. We had no concept. We had never heard of HD. And there had been a lot of odd behaviors in our family. And fortunately, people were always kind. My grandfather was a minister, and there was no shunning of the people with the odd behaviors, where they might stand stiffly or not be able to speak clearly or walk like they're totally drunk when they didn't even believe in drinking. So my dad, when he found out that his dad was diagnosed in California, my dad then got diagnosed and then let my mother know and the 4 children. By then I was just out of high school. And he said, basically, you all live your life. Here now you have more information on what choices you want to make as far as jobs, schooling, whether or not to have kids. And that was a wonderful gift to know what it was in the family and also to have that information. And I did go to college and he was a teacher. And Jeff, we've been together about 20 years, and he knew all about my family, has met my dad. And it was just a miracle in Vegas that the LouRuvo Center was built. It truly was. That's how we met Donna, and then became part of the support group. I have been to other events like HDSA that Donna mentioned. They have a convention every year, and there's research going on. So that's the good news. Someday I believe there will be a cure. I just got diagnosed, had the blood test a year ago. I just felt that I would have it, so we chose not to have children. That was our way just to stop it in one small way, I guess, in the world. And that was a big sacrifice. I saw myself with 6 kids, but that's okay. We're close to family members, and as I said, I was a teacher, and I loved my students. I did start noticing some things. I didn't at first attribute it to HD, where I might have a small group of children, and I was forgetting names, not in a normal way that a teacher might, once in a while. And I thought, well, that's odd. Or I would see a friend, and it's like the recall wasn't there. And then I would just stumble a little or drop some food. My hand would just open for no reason. Or I would pick up something and then it would drop. And so I decided to get tested, and yes, it was positive. A year ago here at the center, they were very supportive. And Jeff was too. So now we're in a different stage. Now that I know for sure, we're just trying to continue to do what we can to help. Like this was a little scary. There are clinical trials. There's Enroll HD. We're going to start soon at this center. And there's also a company called Raptor Pharmaceuticals. Jeff and I just got to meet some people a week ago. And they're doing some clinical trials on some products that they're developing to help with HD. So it's exciting. Donna's right. There's not a cure now, but we believe there will be. Every year, there's so much more brain research. And when one of you had information about how can you stop this? Well, not yet. But what Donna has shared with us before is that protein that she described, and I can't remember the CAG, what it stands for, the 3 terms. But that protein, they're working on research now to change that protein, like where it would change your body, and then that you would not become symptomatic. It would just not be that defective gene. It would correct it. So that will happen someday.
Thank you. What I'm going to do is Jeff is her care partner, and the reason I'm not
Right, in a sense, we're kind of lucky because we went through the process with the father, so we had a good idea of what we could expect out of this. He was really pretty good up until he was age 60, and then the decline was very rapid, and he ended up dying in a hospital. But that's just part of the disease, and we understand that. I started to notice the symptoms in her probably about 2000. There were some of the issues with some obsessive thinking, maybe some behavioral changes, a little bit of irritability, which she never usually had. And then that progressed, and finally, in the last year, we decided, well, maybe we better test and get this on the road so we really know what we're dealing with here instead of trying to actually manage the symptoms with our local doctor. We got her in to see the neurologist here, Dr. Walsh, and then we had the blood test that confirmed everything. And so we've been able to move on with that, and that's really helped us because the medications that they've been providing her have kind of ameliorated some of her anxieties, which is a big issue with her particular stage right now. She's real jumpy. I can't hardly walk by her in the house without her jumping because the situational awareness, I think, has declined somewhat from what it used to be. So even though she knows I'm in the house, she doesn't know that I just was walking behind her temporarily, and she'll like, oh my God. It's like, so.
Who was the doctor? I don't mean to interrupt. Who was the doctor that you were seeing? Walrus?
Walsh.
Oh, Walsh.
Dr. Ryan Walsh, yes.
Dr. Ryan. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
You could spell it.
It's
Can you spell it?
Walsh, W-A-L.
Yeah, she's asking to write it down.
Okay, are we, any,
I can't really think of anything else right now. I mean, we just kind of deal with things on a day-to-day basis as they come up. The biggest issue for me is that, she'll get up in the middle of the night because of some of the obsessive thinking and worry, oh, did I put the clothes in the dryer? And that becomes a problem. Her dad used to get up in the middle of the night as well and be wandering around because he couldn't settle and sleep in a routine way. And so that's some of the things that we're dealing with. Sometimes she's very good with that. It just depends on her mood when she goes to bed. If she's got something the next day, like coming to this meeting, she's up and down a little bit. As long as there's nothing on our plate, then she's fine. But if there's anything that's scheduled, then she kind of gets out there. But that's just all part of it. That's really all I have, unless somebody has other questions or anything.
well, we'll pass
here.
it on to Joanne then. Thank you. I want to introduce, and I hope, Joanne, you're okay with
Yeah,
that.
sure.
Joanne is coming also in terms of her being a caregiver, but she is also a nurse practitioner, right?
I am, yes.
Okay, so she's coming, so she has all this medical background and still is kind of dealing with them in terms of personal.
Well, let me just say that these lovely people who I've just met, they're a hard act to follow because you're an amazing speaker, did a great job. So I've been a nurse and a nurse practitioner for quite a number of years. I was active duty Navy. I followed my Marine Corps husband, who retired way before I did, but he retired in his early 40s. He was done. And honestly, I only knew about HD from school. And when I was in school going through training, it was the one disease that I thought, oh wow, I would not want to have that or have that in my family. So you don't realize what, things that happen. My husband's father was 80-something when he was diagnosed, or 70-something when he was diagnosed with Pick's disease. This was before the DNA testing became available, and he passed away, I think at 82, at 2003. So he had many of the difficulties with many of the things that Donna described, but he basically couldn't swallow. So that was and he was taken care of at home by his wife for 2 years. So then when my husband started to have some cognitive difficulty, and I saw it back in his early 40s, he was falling and he was dropping things and he had problems with organization, keeping on task and on target. He was also diagnosed with Pick's disease. So we went through about 10 years of really not knowing what he had until we were in Newport, Rhode Island, and he saw a neurologist who had a patient who had Huntington's. And he said, let's get a DNA test because you're all over the place. And he goes, I have a feeling that you might have this other disease, and that's what it was. By then we had 2 sons, We have a 34-year-old and a 30-year-old, and both of them do not want to be tested. We've discussed it with them, and they want to live their lives, which, it's up to them. And for some people, that's really important way to go. And we support them. My husband would have loved to have been here today. His humor is really amazing, and he looks at me and says, "You know what, JoJo? Everybody has something." And that's how we deal with it. Every day is different. I agree with so much of what you shared, that day in and day out, depending on the stressors that you might have, how much energy you put into the day, it makes a difference on what the next day will bring. So if we do a lot of shopping on the weekend and I'm, moving him in a lot of different directions, man, he is wiped out the next day, and he could be a mattress tester that next day. So, but I think it's all a matter of everybody has something. And I think that we support one another, we do what we can, and we live our lives. We go out and we live our lives. And I have to agree with Donna that there could be some social isolation. People don't know what he has, so they sort of look at him funny, like, is he drunk? I've seen that expression oftentimes. And, is he just being silly? Is he drunk? Is he mean? He has a lot of facial changes, facial expressions. And of course, he has problems eating sometimes and problems swallowing sometimes. So I can see when we're in a restaurant that some people may not be comfortable with that. And I also know that for me, if I sit to the left side of him, he always moves his head in one direction. So that's better, and it doesn't look like he's looking at the people next to him all the time. So it's just little cues that you pick up and little things that you do to support one another. And honestly, I've changed a lot since nursing school in 1978, and at this stage of the game, I wouldn't have it any other way. So, so just to let you know. But thank you.
These are amazing people, okay? These are amazing people. And I think in terms of being able to share their stories, because this is something that's really difficult to do. It's one thing to read about a disease. It's another one to see people who are living it. And living it means living it with the person who does, and all family and friends who really are trying to support them the best that they can. So thank you so much, Yvonne, Jeff, and Joanne. I really, really do appreciate it, and I think that they do deserve it.